And so on behalf of the Funds team, we're looking forward to this new year of getting to know more filmmakers, your work, and more creative ways to advocate for artists. My name is Maria Santos. I'm the IDA Funds Program Officer. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Keisha Knight, Katie Hurley, and Renelle Schubert, all of whom will introduce themselves when they come on to speak. We wanted to say a big thank you to Selena and Cheyenne who are helping us with the ASL interpretation today, and Denise, who is cart captioning for us on Zoom today. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm calling in from unceded Tongva Chumash land at the IDA offices. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a chubby brown woman with wavy jet black chola hair. I have on thick rimmed glasses with a light pink knitted turtleneck and a white background. I'll quickly go over what we hope to accomplish together in today's session and point you to some helpful tools and reminders, and then we'll begin. First, Keisha will start us by grounding us in the artistic value and intention of the Enterprise Fund. Then the entire team will break down the application questions section by section as we understand it for the Enterprise Fund. Then Katie will highlight important eligibility requirements and go over the timeline. And Keisha will close our presentation time together, and I'll moderate the Q&A right after. Katie is dropping the Enterprise web page in the chat in case you want to peruse as a reference. But before we get started, a few suggestions and reminders for how to use the Zoom. Feel free to keep the chat alive with comments, suggestions, or concerns. We'll watch the chat as best we can and try to respond live if it feels appropriate. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please add them to the Q&A box found in the bottom of your Zoom window. After the presentation at around 10 a.m. Pacific, we'll begin a general Q&A. We'll go through the list of questions in the Q&A chat, as well as any other questions that come up. Feel free to turn on the live captions found at the bottom of your Zoom window if you need them. The session is being recorded for anyone who isn't able to attend the live session, so we'll be able to share that recording by the end of this week. We'll also include a list of links that were shared in the chat along with the recording of the event. So now I'll pass this off to Keisha Knight, our Director of Funds, to get us started.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you, Maria and Katie, especially for organizing this webinar. So excited to have all of you here with us today. So my name is Keisha Knight, and I am the Director of Funds at the International Documentary Association, which means that I work with Maria, Katie, and Renelle to help support filmmakers through our grants and other initiatives. I'm coming to you from the San Bernardino Mountains in Sugarloaf, California, Serrano land, where I recently moved to actually escape Los Angeles. And for a visual description, I am a Black woman wearing a beanie and a cozy sweater in front of a blurred background. And just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on outside of the frame, which is sometimes more interesting than what's going on inside of the frame. Last night we lost power and we had a winter storm here. And so I invited my pit bull companion of 9 years, her name's Princess, into my bed to kind of like, you know, for that body heat kind of component. So we have a very happy dog running around and a little bit of a tired human here in the frame. But sadly for Princess, she doesn't realize that we have power now. So tonight she is going to be sleeping on the floor as usual. To get started though today, I just wanted to start by giving y'all a sense of the history and the genesis of the Enterprise Fund, which is generously funded by the MacArthur Foundation and the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, are kind of ride or die funders who are so committed to this space and just generous and caring and truly inspiring, actually. Really like a huge thank you to them for allowing us to like do this work to support these types of films. I don't want to re-traumatize everyone, but just to give you a sense of where the Enterprise Fund came from, if you think back to 2015, 2016, when this concept of alternative facts was brought to our attention, the Enterprise Fund comes out of this moment when the truth value of documentary and just kind of like truth value in general was really being brought into question. And obviously it's something we're still dealing with today and thinking about like, you know, what is truth? Whose truth? Which truth? And so this fund was the brainchild of Carrie Lozano, a prior director of funds here at the IDA, who comes from a journalism background and wanted to make an intervention to support documentaries working with journalistic practice in a way to combat this discourse around alternative facts and to amplify the work of risk-taking nonfiction filmmakers. So a key report for this effort that Katie, I think, is going to drop in the chat right now, was put out by CMSI at American University in 2015, and it was called Dangerous Documentaries. And I would definitely recommend having a look at it if you haven't seen it already. And another great resource that we wanted to share today that emerged from the work of the Enterprise Fund and the University of Missouri School of Journalism is Mapping the Documentary Landscape, which also I think, Katie, you're going to drop in the chat right now. So these can really help you just kind of ground yourself in like what journalistic practice might be, different types of ways that it's manifesting as you start to develop your submissions. One other thing I just want to mention before I pass it off to Maria is that there are some things that have shifted now that I've taken over as director of funds. I come from a more academic and experimental film, non-journalistic background. And so we've started, while keeping kind of ourselves grounded in this question of journalistic practice, we've started to really become like deeply curious about the ways that aesthetics play into all of this. So our current mantra, which I would encourage you to keep in mind as we go through this webinar, is journalism is not an aesthetic. So what that means is that in terms of thinking about the journalistic question, which is a key, one might say the key component of this fund, we're not thinking about it in terms of what the aesthetics of the film are, but what your process is in terms of developing and grounding your film in research and journalistic practice. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But in short, I'll just say journalistic practice, you can think about it as a methodology, as deep research, as fact-based filmmaking, kind of a rigorous curiosity and practice of trying to materialize like a complete, as opposed to like a partial and propagandistic kind of universe in your film. So this means including complicated and perhaps even dissonant perspectives, but it doesn't mean that your film can't be experimenting with form or that it has to be kind of a traditional information-driven documentary. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be. So one of the things I just also wanted Katie to drop into the chat right now is the Documentary Journalism Summit that we're having at the beginning of March. And this is a way to just kind of serve y'all as you kind of organize your submissions and think about this journalistic question and how you can orient yourselves in it. The entire purpose of the summit, which was co-organized with the Video Consortium, was to help you all think about what journalistic practice is and kind of give you the language to kind of craft that in your applications to the fund. So I think that's it for preliminaries, and I will pass the mic to Maria now, who will go a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of the application process.
Thank you, Keisha. And just to say that our presentation is largely based off the core application that was co-created by Sundance and IDA, and many other organizations to say. And so we'll be going through each of the questions in the application pretty meticulously. And we hope that as we're going through that, you drop the questions in the chat, just do some Q&A, but we'll also have a slideshow going. And we can begin on that. One sec. All right. So our list of application questions can actually be found on the checklist in the Enterprise webpage, and Katie is adding that to the chat now. Thank you, Katie, for all of the chat work. All the questions on the application must be answered in order for your application to be considered. That seems like a weird thing to highlight, but we have received incomplete applications before, so just being really clear that all questions have to be answered. And we'll highlight areas that will have need of clarification historically. So just to highlight logline and project name, they're pretty self-explanatory, but keep in mind that your project name is how we identify your application. So if you have had a name change or something, definitely let us know that in your application. And then for country of production, please include all the countries where your film is being produced. This includes where the film is getting financed and where the film is being filmed. This should not include where the filmmakers are living if that's different from where the film is actually being produced. As far as topic summary, and that's the next slide. As far as topic summary, this gives you the opportunity to guide the reviewer's focus to the relevant cultural, historical, political, and/or social context for the film. You don't have to be exhaustive here. It's instead an opportunity for you to write a focused summary on the topic and show a bit of restraint. Story or concept summary is actually most commonly known as the synopsis, but because nonfiction can be so expansive, this answer should go beyond plot points. Depending on your film's approach, these 1,000 words should include everything that you plan to show on the film and how it will be treated. If the characters are driving the film, then a detailed explanation of who they are and how they will be portrayed would be helpful. If your film is an archival endeavor, speak to the value of the footage and how it will be edited together, etc. We understand that the answer to this question will inevitably change as you continue to develop your film project. So there's nothing here that we consider is set in stone, but it is a moment for you to invite us into your current imagination of your film. This can include questions, posits, and contingency plans. You don't have to guess your ending, but we would like to hear how you anticipate finishing the film. Lastly, the artistic approach will inevitably be described and addressed in the topic or story summary, and possibly in other areas of the application. This is a moment for you to get specific on just a couple of your main visual or auditory approaches. This will tell us more about the intentionality of your audiovisual approach as it pertains to the objective of your film. And I'll pass it back to Keisha.
Thanks, Maria. So I'm going to just speak a little bit right now about the section in the application that is journalistic practice. And thank you, by the way, for all of the questions coming up in the chat. I just want to note that if you want us to answer them in the Q&A, just put them in the Q&A so that they don't get lost as we kind of continue to work through this session. So in terms of journalistic practice, as Maria mentioned, our application is based off the core app with supplemental questions about journalistic practice. So I want to be really clear because I don't want to waste your time, and you shouldn't waste your time applying to a fund that's not for you. If you do not have a well thought out answer to these supplemental questions, I would seriously consider not applying. I'm just going to be real about that. That said, this is also a little bit of a provocation because it's possible that if you take on this provocation of journalistic practice, it's a way that you can actually maybe deepen the roots and the foundation of your film. So for example, actually just this morning, I wake up really early and someone from Europe texted me and was like, hey, I want to apply to Enterprise Fund, but I don't know if I have this journalistic practice thing. And I told them, I said, they're working on a hybrid doc that has a lot of speculative, like Afrofuturistic elements. And I responded and I said, if there's a deep practice of research and fact-based inquiry that's informing the work, and that's something that you can kind of relay to us, then yes, it's absolutely journalistic practice and you should definitely apply. I don't know if this filmmaker is going to take that on, but I just kind of want to put that out there as a way to possibly deepen the work if we're thinking about like a research-based journalistic practice as kind of a foundation and not as kind of an aesthetic sheen to things. So, I just kind of wanted to let you think about whether or not this is something that you're curious about. And if it is, I would definitely encourage you to apply. I would also encourage you in this section about journalistic practice to make sure to give us clues and to guide us into how that's informing your work sample. because there's the written piece and then there's the work sample. And oftentimes we find in evaluating applications that people write written applications that actually are completely not the entire written portion of the application are an opportunity for you to tell the review.
Hi, this is the interpreter. You keep going in and out. I can't hear you. It's like fading.
Let
Yeah,
me
you-
turn up my thing. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Mhm.
So just please let me know if I go in and out again. Sorry about that. So basically, if your work sample doesn't bear witness, I was kind of just vamping, saying the same thing over and over again. So I think it's okay if that minute of sound.
Oh no, Keisha, I think you went out again.
Written work is showing. Oh no, I'm lost again. I'm seeing in the chat. Can you hear me?
It goes in and out, so it's a little hard to test.
Okay, I'll just keep going. So basically, we just want to see that what you're writing about your journalistic practice is also actually manifested in the work sample. I think that's about it for me. But happy to answer any questions about this at the end. I think it's a really important point in terms of like kind of aligning the different parts of your application to the fund and recognizing that, you know, your applications are being read by people in the field, and we want to kind of see like how the entire element, all of the different elements of the application are integrated. So Maria, I'm gonna pass it over to you, who hopefully has better sound.
Thank you. No problem. It really was just at the end. And so, yeah, I will continue to break down the core application. These next few questions address the concept of authorship, which is the personal influence, individual sensibility, and artistic vision that can be found in a director's film work. That would be the most like direct definition of authorship. But over the past few years, possibly right before the pandemic, but I truly can't tell time anymore. The documentary field, as well as many other humanities fields, have required that makers be more explicit about their biases and interests with certain topics or communities that they are portraying in their films or their work. There is an inherent power imbalance between the person holding the camera and making editing decisions and the participants being portrayed. Through the work of many of our colleagues, there has been an increase in discourse around the topic of authorship. It asks that we all be more diligent about our positionality and methodologies to mitigate power imbalances. However, what works for one production may not work for another production. So the following few questions ask that you discuss your reflections, processes, and intentions in order to consider the ethics of making your film. There are no right or wrong answers here, but we are looking for you to show thoughtfulness, methodology, and an understanding of the power of film. Everyone has biases, even if you are of the community that's being featured in your film. So I'll break down some of those questions in these slides. So going to connection and access. In only 250 words, describe how you are connected with the story. Making a film, especially a feature, carries with it a responsibility and positions you as an expert on the topic. The question asks you to reflect whether or not you should be an authority over this topic and or community, and why. Accountability has more to do with process and negotiation with the participants or communities featured in your film. How many times throughout production are you asking for consent? What happens to the film if a participant decides to step away from the film? How informed is the community around what it means to participate in a film? Be as detailed as you possibly can in the 250 words allotted. Then power and positionality. That is more of a reflection of how you see yourself in the world and how your position holds or lacks power. Everyone holds privilege in some areas and not in others, and our privilege is contextual. So this question asks you to be explicit and a little vulnerable. We hope that you can answer as honestly as you can. Then the next slide. The creative control question is mostly one of legality. Who owns the film? To ensure that it is an independent film, but you can also include whether or not you plan to share ownership of the film with others, with your participants, with other crew, legally or not. It's only 50 words, so speak to the legality first and foremost and be really clear about that. And then the community care and safety question is an extension of earlier authorship questions that I mentioned. What values or ethics are guiding the way you and your production team are handling care and safety? Care and safety can be emotional, physical, material, and/or digital, but you don't have to address them all. This can be very specific to the type of film you are making and the community that you are portraying. We also ask that you include how you plan to mitigate anticipated harm to your production crew and/or participants. So that's how authorship is addressed by the core application questions. So just a reminder, please add any questions to the Q&A section of the Zoom window. All right, and then moving on to the next slide, the filmmaker statement and project stage timeline. This brings us to the filmmaker statement. You are only required to include one filmmaker statement, but if multiple directors and/or producers want to include one, that's fine. We just ask that every person only writes up to 500 words. This question does not ask you to list your bio, as that appears later in the application. This is more of an understanding of who you are as an artist. It's helpful for this statement to relate to the current project with which you are applying, but it's not limited to that project. We want to hear about your overall goals and challenges as an artist. Then the project stage and timeline, that's pretty straightforward, but we just ask that you be very specific and careful not to contradict other areas of the application. For example, be specific enough to describe that you've maybe begun filming and still haven't fully developed the film. We know that nonfiction especially does not have a linear production timeline. So the more detail that you add, the more we can understand what your production needs at this time. This question will also inform how much funding we think you will need. Phew. Okay, that was a lot for me. I'll pass it back to Keisha to keep going on the last few items of the core application.
Thanks, Maria. Hopefully my sound will work this time. Please let me know if I drop out. So yeah, core application. I know there are complicated feelings around that maybe we can all talk about when we meet at film festivals. But I did want to talk about budget. So budget. Katie, can you just drop the budgeting link into the chat? This might seem like, I don't know, a non-creative element of the application, but we really look at your budgets. For us, we read them like a novel. We take them into consideration in thinking about where the funds that we have can be most useful. So to us, a budget is a creative document. It's also a political document. And so I really encourage you to take it seriously, not as just kind of an add-on or something that's just numbers that add up, whatever, but like really think about like what the story that your budget is telling. And I'm just gonna do a little sidebar soapboxing here, but I think that personally, one of the shortcomings of our funding ecosystem, and this speaks to audience consideration in particular, the audience consideration and accessibility portion of the application. One of the shortcomings of our funding ecosystem right now is that we don't focus enough on the life of a film after it's made, right? This is something that we're hoping to address in the future, in the coming years at IDA. But I mean, I think the funding ecosystem has done a really good job of opening more space for filmmakers and particularly those from historically excluded communities. But you know, it's as if once the film is made, there's a hard stop and suddenly, you know, the mic problem has happened again. Can you hear me? Can people hear me? Yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay. So we've done a really good job at opening up space for people, for different types of filmmakers and voices and projects. But there's this moment, right, when your film is done and boom, now you have to like deal with the free market. And so this is one of the glaring deficiencies of the system, that it'll take time, but just we're working on it. But I did want to say that the audience consideration question is really geared at helping us to understand what you consider your target audience to be. And for me, I can't speak to the rest of the team, but for me, I read this as like, what are the politics of your film, basically? So if it's a general Netflix audience, okay. But I would also highly recommend you thinking about what a more targeted and focused audience for your film might be. So for example, something that we often see is that we often get proposals that have really radical visions and that say, you know, I'm doing this and that, and I'm taking care in all these ways. And then once I create my radical vision, I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder, which I understand is the kind of realpolitik of the system that we're working in right now. But there's just a dissonance there to think about, and, you know, to kind of just like think through in terms of like how your film is going to move through the world. So I'll just kind of put that there. It's a much bigger conversation, but that's what audience consideration is. And it's a question that can really show us like how you're kind of seeing the life of this film. And in terms of accessibility, obviously, everyone should have closed or open captions. And actually, we're requiring that from our work samples. And Renelle is going to speak a little bit about that. But I would also encourage you to go further in thinking about how to make your films accessible. This also kind of ties back into audience consideration. How do you make your films accessible to those with limited economic and digital limits to access? Like, what are the ways that kind of excluded communities can access your film? Do you have a vision for that? Even if it's some kind of pipe dream vision, like what is your vision for that? And so kind of moving on to the next slide with intended impact and key creative personnel. I think the intended impact I kind of spoke about with accessibility and audience. It's pretty self-explanatory. Impact campaigns are great, but, you know, just, you know, make sure they're just not lip service, right? And then in terms of key creative personnel, this is a big one. It's very simple, but just make sure we know whose bios go with who. And also in terms of executive producers, I just want to be really clear that executive producers don't count as producers for eligibility requirements. So your executive producer could have produced 1,000 films, but if your producer and director have only produced one each, the film won't be eligible. It's not worth your time applying, and it won't even be moved into the reviewer stage. So if you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to us at the fund's email. And then finally, financial information and the comprehensive line item budget, which is the next slide. So yeah, I mean, in terms of financial information, I spoke a little bit about budget, but we want to know how you're envisioning planning on filling your gap. And this could also kind of be related to your timeline for completion. I would encourage you to include your aspirational plans, your kind of middle of the road plans, and your worst case scenario plans, right? Because it just gives us a sense that you're kind of committed to seeing this film through in whatever way kind of comes forward to be able to make it happen. So funding to date is also important. It just gives us a sense of the community of funders we'll be a part of, but you don't necessarily have to have a lot of other like high level funders in order for us to fund your film. That's not important to us, but it just gives us a sense of kind of like where your film is circulating in terms of the funding ecosystem. And then finally, the grant impact is actually something that we look really, really closely at, kind of understanding how the funding that we'll be able to give you will make an impact to your project. So try to be as detailed here as you can, and it'll allow us to understand kind of how the funds will be used. And that's something we really take into consideration in kind of the final stages of the review process. And now I'll pass it on to Renelle, our program manager of the Nonfiction Access Initiative, to talk a little bit more about the work sample.
Thanks, Keisha. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Renelle. I am a white woman with medium brown hair that's down to my shoulders. I'm wearing gray today. And I have a blurred background. Some of you might know me already from other IDA capacities, such as the IDA Awards and Getting Real, as well as education. Or some of you might be familiar with the What's Up with Docs podcast. But I am now back at IDA, and I am as Keisha mentioned, the Nonfiction Access Initiative Funds Program Manager. So what is NAI? Well, through a regrant fund from the Foreign Foundation, NAI is actually not just a fund, it is a movement aimed at narrative change through building power, community, and increasing opportunities for nonfiction filmmakers who identify as disabled. As Keisha mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about the work sample. You are required to provide a prior work sample, and this should basically exemplify the best of your work. For current work samples, it must be 10 to 15 minutes in length. Any sample that's shorter than 10 minutes are actually not eligible because it's not enough material for reviewers to fully evaluate your project. You can submit a longer sample if you would like, but it's very important that you indicate which 15 minutes you would like the reviewer to watch. If you do not do that, they will end up watching the first 15 minutes. There's really no limits on what you can show in your work sample. And we really don't encourage you not to spend a lot of extra time and resources on it. The idea really is to provide a portion of your film that really represents the project as a final film. It's actually much more ideal to get a full scene or scenes than a trailer in which you're cutting up into multiple pieces. As was mentioned prior, for work samples, captioning is required. And that's for all submitted work samples. We are currently in the research processes of creating best practices for the NAI fund. And as part of that work, we are also reevaluating processes in our other programs and how we can be more open and accessible in the work that we do. And part of that process, we want to bring in more perspectives in the reviewing process, and having captioned work samples allows us to invite reviewers from the deaf community to take part. I do want to mention those of you who are submitting projects in different languages, subtitles will be accepted. The preference is open captions in English, but closed captions are also acceptable. I want to say also, though access is important, we all encourage you to think about captioning as a creative process that can actually enhance your film. There's a really great article that from a deaf filmmaker named Delbert Wetler that came out this week that also asks you to think about how the use of open captions can enhance creativity, not just accessibility. I know Katie's going to drop that into the chat. When it comes to like the options of captioning or the production of, for many folks, if you have the means, there are professional film captioners. For instance, Cheryl Green, I know she's very popular. We're going to drop her information in the chat. There's also pay services like the Rev and 3Play that offer captioning services for a fee. But I will say that those platforms don't really fully capture the full artistry of what captioning can do. I'm definitely going to share, Katie's going to share a video from artist Christine Sun Kim that rewrites closed captioning. It's a pop-up magazine video which she really illustrates, that artistry that's involved when it comes to thinking about captioning. And you can also create your own captioning. I know editing platforms like Adobe Premiere also allow you to do that. And if any of you are going to, want to start attempting to creating your own captioning, again, I highly recommend checking out that video from artist Christine Sun Kim. You'll really learn a lot. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Katie to talk about eligibility and timeline.
Thanks, Renelle. I'll go ahead and introduce myself really quickly. I'm Katie Hurley. I'm the grants coordinator here at IDA. So if you've ever reached out about your project to the funds email, that's usually me you're speaking to. And then going forward, I'll also be monitoring that email submittable. Visual description: I'm a white woman in a blue sweater with dark blonde hair tied back with a blurred background. And we're almost to the Q&A, so I'm just going to go through eligibility really quickly. Feel free to drop your questions in specifically the Q&A box that we have. So actually I need to do a few disclaimers about eligibility. The funds team, we're actually the ones who go through each project. So when you submit your project, we go through it very carefully to make sure that you meet all of these requirements. And if you don't meet these eligibility requirements, we don't move the project on to the review period. And I'm not putting all of the eligibility requirements here. There are a few more, so I'd recommend checking out the website. And so then I'll go ahead and highlight some specific ones. The fund is open to all locations. We really welcome non-US projects. If you are outside of the US and no one on your team has a US tax ID, we do require a US fiscal sponsor, and this is just because of the grant payment purposes. If you're a US project, you don't have to have a fiscal sponsor. And then a lot of questions we get are around the credit requirement that Keisha mentioned. So I'll try to make this clear. One person on your team, a director or producer, has to have completed 2 documentary feature-length films prior to submitting your application. And it has to be one person that holds those credits, either the director or the producer on the project. It can't be an executive producer. So if your credits that you're listing are EP credits, we don't count those. And then if the EP on this project, if you're listing their credits, we also don't count those. And so I've listed here how we'll ask you to show your previous credits on the application. We ask for the film title, when it premiered, your position, so director or producer or both, and then the runtime. That way we can make sure it's a feature. So hopefully that's a bit more clear. And then this is more of a project eligibility, or just a question that I get quite often. The request can be up to 100,000, and it does not affect your chances of being selected if you ask for that full amount. If you have that gap in production expenses, we highly recommend putting 100,000. If you ask for less, it doesn't, either way, it doesn't affect your chances of being selected. And then I'll go on to the next slide, a little bit more about eligibility. So your project has to be a feature length, cannot be a short, cannot be a student project. We don't accept solely biographical films or historical films unless there's a contemporary relevance. And this is going back to the contemporary relevance. We also would like the project to be of a critically important nature. Is your project too niche? Will it reach a large audience? Questions like that are what we evaluate when looking at your project. And you have to have production costs remaining. It's okay if you're at the very end of production and you might have some deferred costs such as salaries, but you have to have production remaining. So I've listed what we consider production costs here: staff, crew, travel, gear rental, and so on. We do actually allow editors' salaries in the grant request because we understand that you're often going in between production and post production and back and forth. So we will consider that a production cost, but you cannot request finishing costs such as color and sound. That indicates that you're too far along to be considered in production. And I think that covers what I wanted to highlight for eligibility. I'll just say again, make sure you check out our website to read all of the eligibility requirements. And then for our selection timeline, we just wanted to give you a look behind the scenes to see why it takes so long for us to pick the projects. So the open call will open this March 2nd and it'll close April 4th. Basically right at midnight. We just put it a minute early just so that you don't miss the deadline. Once it closes, our team reviews each of the applications throughout April for eligibility, and then we'll pass it on to our external reviewers. These are people we look for in the industry. They could be journalists, filmmakers, programmers, and we try to have at least one filmmaker and one journalist review every project. So you'll have 2 external reviewers reviewing your project thoroughly. They have about a month to do that. And then once all of their reviews are submitted, we select the finalists based off of their reviews, based off of need, the budgets like Keisha was mentioning. And then we'll reach out to the finalists for updates. The updates include general questions like, have you brought in any more crew members? Or what are you filming? Things like that. And then it's also an opportunity to address any questions that came up in your proposal. We read through the reviews. And if there are any questions that we think need answering, we'll also submit those to you. And then the projects, along with those updates, will go to the panelists. These tend to be people kind of at the height of their career in the film industry. They're decision makers. And so they'll individually review the finalists, and then they'll meet to select the grantees over a 3-day period in late July. And then finally, we'll notify the grantees that they've been selected late July to early August. There are a couple of times throughout this where we'll notify people. So if you have not been selected as a finalist, we will reach out and let you know. That way you don't have to wait all the way until July. Making sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, when we select the grantees, it is a range of 25 to 100,000. It just depends on the need, and we like to have a diverse selection of grantees in terms of the filmmaker, the topic, the approach. And so all of that is also considered, and we tend to select approximately 10 projects. And I think that's it for our slideshow. I think Keisha's just going to discuss selection criteria a little bit. So not the very black and white eligibility, but more what are reviewers analyzing for.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so we're almost getting ready to wrap. We're actually going to finish our information heavy section a little bit early. So please drop your questions into the chat. We'll have plenty of time, not the chat, sorry, the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time to answer them. So yeah, just really quickly, I mean, I think we've really covered most of it here. Hopefully it's been intelligible, and if not, you can review the video. Also want to just underline, like, we are at your service. So please email us at funds@documentary.org if you have any questions that are specific to your project that we don't get a chance to answer today. Just want to underline that, you know, there's not a specific type of film that we're looking for. And I think, Katie, if you could drop the list of films we funded last year into the chat, because we're really focusing on journalistic methodology as kind of like our first layer of review. And this is something that comes in our first kind of review process. Once we get to the final panelist stage, we're really looking at kind of curating a breadth of different aesthetic approaches. There are so many incredible projects, and we really track even people that like maybe didn't even necessarily make it to the finalist round. We really keep tracking your projects over the years and encourage you to like keep reapplying as we kind of watch how the project is developing. Again, I just want to emphasize that we're really opening everything up this year more internationally, not requiring that you have a US-based producer. But again, there are some questions that are coming up about fiscal sponsorship that we'll answer, but really kind of want to not only have a broad aesthetic range, but a broad representation of different regions and different voices. Yeah, I think that's really it. I mean, I feel like we've been pretty comprehensive and just really want to hear from you all about what questions you have. And again, really want to encourage you to reach out to us and use us as a resource. We're here to support you in this process. And with that, I'll pass it back to Maria and maybe we can open it up for Q&A.
Thank you. And yeah, I will just ask that Vernell and Katie join us for this Q&A. Everyone can just settle back into their seats because we have several questions in the Q&A, some that will just join together because they sort of pertain to the same thing. Just pointing out that a few people are just asking very individually about their projects. And so just whether or not they would be eligible for this. So just joining in two questions. Do you consider a 50-minute documentary to be feature length? And there was another one about a 52-minute documentary. So would that be eligible? And I can answer this one. So we consider feature length to be over 40 minutes. And so, yes, 50 to 52 would be eligible for this particular eligibility requirement. Another question about Puerto Rico. Do folks from Puerto Rico need a fiscal sponsor since it is a Commonwealth of the United States? Keisha, you want to answer that one?
So actually, Puerto Rico, you don't need a fiscal sponsor. You can just go ahead and just apply, and that's it.
Thank you. And then, Katie, what is the average amount that you pay out per project?
The average amount is 50,000. Most of the projects I would say get 50,000, with maybe a couple getting 25 and then a couple 100,000, but on average, I'd say 50.
Great. Yes. And we usually, it's up to $100,000, which I know Katie mentioned already. And then Keisha, I have directed one feature documentary and am the producer of another feature documentary that has recently completed and already has a fall 2023 broadcast. Would that count as two completed projects?
Yes, it would. I feel like this is a test. Yes, that would. And if we had any questions about that, we would reach out to you. But yeah.
There was another question in here that was already sort of answered around narrative fiction features. Those, just so you know, are not part of the eligibility requirements. They have to be 2 feature-length nonfiction films. All right. If the team has docuseries credits, 1 feature doc credit, multiple short doc credits, and multiple narrative feature credits, does that count? Rachel, if I'm reading this correctly, docuseries nonfictions do count, but the narrative or the fiction features do not count.
I would also add to that even if you have a team that has 7 separate docuseries credits and each person only has 1, that's not going to count. It's 1 person with 2 credits. That's the kind of hard line. So if you think that you don't, I mean, depending on how motivated you are to apply, would think about maybe bringing someone onto your team that has that kind of credit so that you can get through the eligibility. And just so you know, I just want to kind of reiterate why we do this. It's because like this fund is really geared toward mid-career filmmakers that we know are going to finish these projects. It's the reason why we require those 2 credits, because we know that someone has a track record in finishing projects. So yeah, if you have any other questions about that, again, please feel free to reach out. I know it seems a little bit hardcore, but it is something that we're quite kind of stringent about.
Mhm. And then there are a couple of questions around how many applications we've received in the past. Katie, do you feel comfortable answering this?
Yeah, I can say last year off the top of my head. So last year we received a little over 250, around 190 something passed the eligibility check. And then through those, out of those 190, we selected about 22 finalists, and we then selected 11 grantees.
Perfect. Keisha, is there a gap that you are seeing in the international documentary and funding landscape when it comes to journalistic depth?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that there's a gap that I'm personally seeing, and it's also a gap that I've discovered, also my own ignorance, just in this discourse in the documentary field generally. I think that there is a lot more funding for more personal documentaries internationally. At least at IDA, we don't have a fund for kind of non-journalistic personal docs. But I think that just in general, there's actually a real kind of blind spot in terms of thinking about what journalistic practice is with regard to documentary that we really want to try to kind of like push into a little bit. I would say I do think that it's quite possible that in the US we're a little bit more obsessed with this investigative journalism tact, but it's an interesting space to kind of navigate.
Yeah. So back to eligibility questions. Can the credit be from a consulting producer? And I can answer this one just to say that we'd prefer for it to be somebody who's very active on crew. Some consulting producers take a very active role. Some consulting producers can act more as like executive producers, but if that is a way that you are actually building out your team of support for a more emerging filmmaker, that's fine, but just make it really, really clear what the consulting producer's responsibilities will be. Okay, one other question that just encouraging anyone to jump in if they have an answer. It's a little bit of a long one. Can the producer and director be the same person? I had no funding for my film, so I had to fund the production trip to Brazil myself. I'm the producer, director, cinematographer. And despite that, the quality is extremely high, and I've created a short documentary that has already won an award. So will I be able to apply? I don't have money for closed captioning for my film sample. I've taken huge financial risks to do this project.
I can take this one. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the producer and the director can definitely be the same person. It can be a one-person show if you have the two nonfiction feature-length credits. So in terms of that element, that's not an issue at all. And also just want to acknowledge like the commitment to your project in terms of like taking those risks. In terms of the closed captioning, if there's no money for closed captioning, as Renelle mentioned, would recommend that open captions through Adobe Premiere on the 10-minute work sample are probably the best way to go. And if you have any more questions about how to do that, please just email us and we can kind of help walk you through. We know that it's a new thing that we're requiring, and so we would definitely want to be in support of that and make sure that everyone can do it in a way that kind of makes sense.
Thanks for that, Keisha. If you apply for the full amount, does that reduce your likelihood of getting the grant? Will you grant a lesser amount in certain circumstances?
I can answer that one. Let me just tell you, everybody applies for the full amount. There is not a single application that came through last year that wasn't for $100,000. So feel free, apply for the full amount. We're really, this is where the budget comes in terms of how we understand like what. Another thing is that we also want to kind of see that we can fund as many projects as possible. So how we understand how we divide up the funds that we have is kind of based on your budget and how you describe the grant impact. But everybody applies for 100K. That's just kind of what happens.
It's true. And if that's your budget gap or more, then we definitely encourage you to do that. That's totally fine. About a prior work sample, the type of films that fits the fund brief, or what would you consider? I am going to ask that Rehad just retype that question. I'm not completely sure what's being asked, but there were a couple more questions around journalistic practice. Someone asked just very broadly, can you talk more about journalistic practice? How detailed of a discussion of journalistic sources do you wish to see?
I can talk about that. Again, it's really something that is underthought in the field. So it's something as detailed as possible is great. Again, I would just, in terms of journalistic practice, broad strokes, what's your research process? What is the fact-based kind of like motivation of this project? How are you bringing in different voices? How are you checking your sources? If you're checking your sources, if you're engaging in citizen journalism and that kind of process, which would be maybe more aligned with things like autoethnography or community-based practice, talk about that. Who are you pulling off of? Even referencing other films that are inspirational, that are working in this way, that's really useful too. Again, I would just highly recommend looking at those resources that we will also send out in a follow-up one sheet, possibly joining the Documentary Journalism Summit. All of these are designed to kind of help answer these questions, because this is also, I think, for all of us on the funds team, an open question as well. Like, this is something that we have to kind of think through together as a field. And we're actually also really interested. I mean, if you want to be provocative, like maybe it's the anti-journalism, I don't know, like open to kind of whatever you kind of think is appropriate for your project. Hopefully that's useful.
Very useful. Katie, for you, would you reach out to applicants if they don't meet all of the requirements so they get a chance to complete it and resubmit?
That is a good question. No, because we don't have the bandwidth, unfortunately. If it's something like your work sample link is broken, I will reach out and let you know so that reviewers can watch it. But because our eligibility is publicly in the website and the open call is, you do have that month. If you submit it within that month before it's due and want to change something, you can reach out. But after the deadline, you can't make changes. So if you're not eligible, it won't go through, unfortunately. So I would just strongly consider checking out the eligibility before the April 4th deadline, and you can always reach out to me before then if you're not sure if you're eligible.
Thank you, Katie. And another question, also, Renelle, feel free to jump in whenever. I don't want to put you on the spot. Renelle is very new to our team, so I don't want to put you on the spot. Just let me know. Which works better in terms of a prior work sample? Films that have journalistic concerns / integrity at the center, or would you rather a sample that speaks to the dramaturgical approach that you're intending to take? Thanks, Rehad, for rewriting that question.
I can actually speak to that a little bit. I would say, so the work samples that work worst are like highly curated trailers and like sizzle reels. It's not useful. It doesn't give us a sense of how you're approaching the material. So Rehad, for this question, there could be a work sample in which you maybe included 5 minutes of each kind of, or maybe like some kind of ratio that you describe in the written section, which is like, so this is the journalistic approach that I've taken in the past, and that is going to happen through this film, but it's going to be kind of intertwined with these kind of aesthetic elements that are shown in the second half. So you can get, creative with your work sample for sure. And that could potentially serve your purpose if you have, you know, I guess I would just say don't be shy with the work sample, and also don't be shy to let people, the reviewers and our team, just sit with your material. We find that the strongest work samples are often those that allow us to actually like sit in a scene and understand how the filmmaker is using the camera, is interacting with the participants, rather than something that's really kind of like slick and flashy. Those are generally like not particularly useful and don't let us go deeper and kind of like intertwining like the written work and the work sample. I don't know. Renelle, I saw you nodding your head. Do you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's been the thought for a long time, that it's just trailers, sizzle reels, like you say, don't let us sit with what you're really trying to present.
And related to that, does the 10 to 15 minute sample have to come from a feature length film? And I'll just say, so there are two different work samples. One is a prior work sample that just shows 10 to 15 minute clip of anything that you've produced before. It could come from a short, could be split up into like a short and a feature, or just come from a feature. It'll just give us an idea of past work that you've made. And then for the current work sample, we do ask that it comes from the feature length film that you're applying for with. Okay, couple of other questions. Would you consider the classical interview methodology as a prerequisite for journalistic inquiry?
Can you repeat that question, Maria?
Would you consider the classical interview methodology as a prerequisite for journalistic inquiry?
So could be for sure. It kind of depends. I'm breaking that up into two different threads. There's a way that you can use interview, right? Like if it's kind of participant-based research, community-based research, that's a way of informing your film. And that's definitely kind of a research-based practice. And I just want to kind of make that separate from a certain kind of talking head kind of way of approaching documentary film. So the thing with the interview methodology is that it can often be one-sided. So we want to just, one of the things we're looking for is how are you, even if your film is very focused in terms of like your participants and who you're focusing on, how are you as a filmmaker kind of getting your knowledge as an investigator, getting your knowledge about the field, you know, that work that you do, right? Like might not even show up in the frame, all of that background work. And interview can definitely be a part of that for sure.
Thanks, Keisha. We have a few more other questions that are a bit specific to these filmmakers. So I'm just trying to save those for the end. Katie, if a short version of our film wins awards or is accepted at new festivals after the deadline, can we inform and update you in our application?
You're welcome to update us. That is something we'd ask in the finalist updates for you to include. So if it goes on to the panel round, then they would be informed about that.
I would also add there that even though awards are amazing, like it's not overly swaying for us, you know? Like whether your film's won a lot of awards or hasn't won any awards, like that's not really one of our main criteria in terms of judging the film. Whether your film has a lot of funders or no funders, again, not one of the main criteria for us in judging the film. So I just want to be really clear about that.
Thank you. Very specific question, but just want to ask it. I came in late and this question may have been presented. Will you fund a documentary about the urban rebellions that have not been covered by other documentaries?
Yes.
I think out more detail, I'm just inclined to say yes, but curious.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Someone else asks if we want a bibliography of the research. And just to say, it's not totally necessary, but if you want to show that to us because you think it's going to be relevant for any reason, we're happy to receive the materials.
Yeah, it could also be something that, just thinking about word count, something that you potentially include as a link. Like if there's a link that we can link to that shows the bibliography, it's always interesting to see what sources and people you're thinking with for sure. But yeah, not necessary.
Katie, what is the gross sum that is being granted and how many projects? Well, we've already said how many projects do we typically get applications for, but what is the gross sum?
The gross sum this year is 450,000.
Thank you.
Mhm.
How important is impact in our consideration, including impact campaigns that are co-occurring with the documentary creation?
I'll jump in here. Yeah, impact is definitely something that we're really interested in terms of just understanding like how you see your film intervening in the world is something that's very relevant for us and you know, gives us a lot of impetus to support it for sure.
Thank you. And Vernal, I don't know if you can help us with this one. Are you going to talk about the need for fiscal sponsors? It's a new territory for me, so what should I look out for?
So again, it's for those of you who are working outside the US, a fiscal sponsor is required. There are a lot of institutions that provide fiscal sponsorship. IDA is one, Women Make Movies, Film Collaborative, Fractured Atlas, just to name a few. But yeah, again, if you're working outside the US, fiscal sponsorship will be required.
And I guess any tips for like what folks should be looking for in terms of fiscal sponsors?
It can be the thing with fiscal sponsorship, it can be at different levels. So it just depends on the services that you will need yourself. Some fiscal sponsors handle a lot of everything, who gets paid out, all of that. And some fiscal sponsors only have sort of a soft level touch. It really, when it comes to fiscal sponsorship, it is based on, the service that is provided is based on a fee. You get charged a certain amount of fee, and that fee can raise and lower depending on the services that is required of the fiscal sponsor. I would say generally an average percentage is about 5%.
And just for those who are still on the call who might not know, basically a fiscal sponsor is someone who can accept funds as a nonprofit on your behalf. They basically accept the funds for you, and then, as Renelle mentioned, they take out that fee and then give the rest of the funds for you. So if you are, just budget note, if you do have a fiscal sponsor, make sure that you include that fee in your budget, because you're going to be, 5% off of everything that you get in terms of grants and possible donations.
There was this other question previously, and I just wanted to say for everyone, you can apply to the fund with more than one project, but it has to be one project per application. And then it's not very likely that we'll fund many projects by the same filmmaker, though not impossible. So just saying that out loud, that you can apply with multiple projects, but you'll have to fill out an application for every single project that you apply with. Another question, how important are partners with other organizations, for example, for climate change nonprofits and conferences, since this film is about climate change? So I figure that's more for impact.
Yeah, that sounds like impact. And the bigger network that you have already set up for impact, the more convincing kind of the plan is, or the more developed the plan is, it's very convincing to us. Yeah.
Would a film close to wrapping production and further into post still qualify? So yes, as long as you still have production costs left in your budget that are unpaid, it would still qualify. And we are thinking about post-production is different in the United States than it is outside of the United States. So when we say post, there can still be editing left. You can still pay an editor. What we just won't fund are finishing costs, which are more like, you know, sound and color correction at the end. All right. Do you plan to relaunch the development funding?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, so those of you who have more of a history with the Enterprise Fund know that it has slowly been shrinking. But yes, I am actually actively fundraising I'm not sure that we're actually going to exactly relaunch the development fund right away. That kind of depends on the amount of interest we get in terms of funding it. We have to find other funders for it. But we are trying to support more shorts and more journalistically focused shorts that have kind of like an immediate circulation plan. And that's something that we're in the process of getting funding for. So Enterprise will be expanding again, no worries. Not sure if it's going to be in the exact same capacity, but would love your input on that though. Like if you have some ideas, like please do let us know. Again, funds@documentary.org. We're in service of you, so tell us what you need.
Another one, Katie, does a fiscal sponsor have to be from a nonprofit? If this is purely for tax purposes, can this be a US production company?
If you have a US production company on board, you don't need a fiscal sponsor. So if the US fiscal sponsor is required if your project and entire crew are based outside of the US. If that, Keisha, I feel like you wanted to add something there, but hopefully that answers.
Oh no, you were reading my bio.
Okay.
No, that's right. Exactly right. So yeah, if you have a US-based production company and producer on board, there's no need for a fiscal sponsor. If you're outside the US and don't have any US-based producers, then you'll need to get a fiscal sponsor.
Great. All right. This is a question that might require some follow-up, but can a social enterprise business plan be shared to represent the thinking process vision for the impact desire post-documentary? So can a social
That's an interesting idea. Would love to see it. I would just offer that, you know, make sure that we as reviewers and as people looking at the proposal understand like how this actually relates to the film. So if you just send through a plan, could be a great plan, but if we don't understand how it relates to the film, it's going to be more confusing than helpful in terms of understanding what your impact is. So if you can contextualize it, then absolutely. But again, there's the word count.
Thank you. Highlighting this question, are we required to include secured funding to finish our film, or can we include hypothetical sources if yet to get approved?
I
I
can.
can,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, you can include both. We actually, most people would list that in the, I think you'll see it in the presentation, but you could list it as secured and then pending. So you're welcome to include both of those. Just be clear about which is which.
Even I think we've seen to apply.
Mm-hmm. If you haven't actually submitted to it yet.
Mm-hmm. What if we don't have access to produce/directed long form docs like on video, not accessible by link or anything?
I feel like that is I mean, if you want to send us a DVD, we could talk about that. But maybe that's something that you want to,
Your sound just cut out a little bit.
Yes, I'm really
Sorry, it's cutting out.
a case basis.
It's a case by case basis. Yeah. And maybe you do want to send a follow-up to this only because we don't need to see long form work. What we just need is for you to write down the credit. So if you have 2 past feature films, you're going to have to write down the credit. It's very clear on the application how to write down the credit. And so the only work sample that we're asking for is the 10 to 15 minutes prior work sample, and then the 10 to 15 minutes current work sample. So you won't need access to long form work. Okay. I think we answered this already, but can a fiscal sponsor be an incorporated company in the US if you are a non-US based filmmaker? So the answer is yes. Incorporated company like an LLC or something like that, that will allow you to be able to get paid in the United States. So that's yes. You don't need.
But that is not a fiscal sponsor. A fiscal sponsor is really, really specific. And it's a fiscal sponsor. So if you're an LLC, that's something different. If that's how you want to get paid for your production, that's fine. If you have something in the US, a US based entity, that is your production company, but that is not a fiscal sponsor. Just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, the important thing is that it has 501c3 status. That is really what makes a fiscal sponsor legit.
Thank you. Okay, and then last 2 questions, again, are a little bit more specific about eligibility. If you have more than 2 feature-length films to your credit, does this disqualify you from applying to this fund?
No, it's just a minimum. So you don't have to be specifically a mid-career. It's more that you have to at least have those credits, if that makes sense. So if you have more, you're definitely eligible.
Thanks, Katie. And you only have to list 2. I recently completed my first feature and have served as an editor on a number of investigative journalism projects. Is it possible to submit the 2 feature requirements with another form of media? So if I'm reading this correctly, you completed a first feature and have a number of investigative journalism projects. If they are long form, then yes, but I'm not sure what would be the other form of media. Like if it's a VR project or a fiction film, then no, those wouldn't be eligible. It has to be a nonfiction feature or long form film that you've made in the past.
And in this case, if people don't have credits, they often do kind of look to, it's an interesting opportunity to develop your team and see if there are producers that are interested in your project or other co-collaborators who do have those credits and would allow you to be eligible for the fund. So, and I think we answered all the questions. Look at that.
All the questions. I promise that I marked some dismissed, but it just was that we had already answered them. So we answered all of the questions. As a reminder, please email the funds@documentary.org email address if you have any further questions. And then Katie, I think you're going to drop some links in the chat just so in March, coming soon, we have the Journalism Summit. So that will be an opportunity for you to learn more about journalism and can inform your application writing. We'll also have 2 different office hours where Katie and I will be just sitting in a room waiting if anybody has any specific questions. One will be focused for international folks, just because we know that there's probably less of a familiarity with the core application. And so that will be, I believe, on March 14th. And then, when I say international projects, I mean non-US based projects. And then we'll have another office hours on March 29th for IDA members and fiscal sponsorship projects. So if you're not an IDA member, but you would like to join that session, there's information on how to join our members on our website at documentary.org. All right.
We'll also be sending out a one sheet. We've dropped a lot of links and a lot of information in the chat, and we will be sending that out to you since you've registered as a one sheet, but also just feel free to reach out to us again at funds@documentary.org if you have any specific questions or questions that weren't answered.
Thank you. And then just a really big thank you again to Cheyenne and Selena and Denise for helping us out today. It is very, very helpful and appreciated. So take care, everyone. Thanks so much for spending this morning with us. Bye.